In his book, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis discusses what he calls the Tao. And that is a kind of moral law that exists independently of human beings and is universal. This thing that Lewis describes, what he calls the Tao, is I think a lot like what the Stoics referred to when they spoke of a moral law. I think it's what St. Paul refers to in the first chapter of his letter to the Romans. And that is, the idea is that just as there are natural physical laws that exist in the world independently of human beings, for example, the rate at which the earth spins, that's a natural physical law over which human beings have no control. Just as there are natural physical laws at work in the universe, so there are moral laws at work in the universe. And human beings, I guess differently from natural laws, human beings do have some power over what they will do in response to an external moral law that exists. Of course, human beings can't really, do anything, certainly not in their ordinary day-to-day affairs, can't do anything about the rate at which, the speed at which the planet spins on its axis. Human beings can't do anything about that. They do have some power when it comes to the promptings of the moral law that exist independently of human beings. What C.S. Lewis notes is that you can look at literature from ancient times and from more recent times, and you can look at literature from very, very different cultures. And what you'll find is, although these cultures are very different, and although these cultures have their own particularities, that often what you'll find are common moral ideas underpinning what end up being very different outlooks on the world, but underpinning these very different outlooks on the world are some common moral themes. And this is what Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, refers to as the Tao. And he says that there are certain attitudes that are really true. And these truths are linked to something external to us. These aren't truths that human beings make up. These are truths that human beings discover. Certain attitudes are really true. Others are really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are. Maybe I would translate that this way, that the universe is a certain way, and human beings are certain kinds of creatures. And if human beings want to get through life doing as much good for themselves and others as possible, and as little harm to themselves and others as possible, then there are certain laws, moral laws, that they should follow. Whether they live in Asia or Europe, whether they live in Russia or South Africa, whether they live in ancient times or modern times, there are certain moral laws that human beings can discern and should abide by if they want to do as much good in the world for themselves and others, and as little harm to themselves and others. This goes along with a phrase from the Hebrew book Ecclesiastes, where the Hebrew writer says that God has set eternity in the human heart. There's this idea that, human beings have the capacity to discern eternal values. And I think this is Lewis's idea, and other thinkers have picked up on this as well. Let's look at some examples. This example comes to us from the writer in the late Middle Ages, Thomas à Kempis, who writes The Imitation of Christ. So this is obviously a Christian text, right, from the latter Middle Ages. And he says, "What do you seek here, that is, here on earth, since this is not your final resting place?" There's that sense that there's something more than this world. That is, there's something more than what surrounds us right now. There's something more than what we can take in with our own senses right now. So remember that all things in this world are passing away, and that your true home is in heaven. If you're wise, Thomas à Kempis says, then you'll recognize that what's all around you is fleeting and passing away. And there's something deeper, there's something truer, there's something more enduring that is not immediately around you, that's eternal. And that is the thing that is the thing on which we should set our minds and our affections, that is, our desires. Of course, we have to get along in the world, we have to take care of ourselves and other people in the world, but we always want to keep in mind that there's something outside this world. There's something outside this world. And so that's an idea from this Christian writer. Then we go back to ancient times, to ancient Asia. And here we have this quote from a Buddhist text. Come, see this world like a painted royal, right? Where the foolish sink down, the wise have no attachment. This world is the place where the foolish sink down. The wise don't get too attached to it. Now, if we look back at the previous quote, what do you seek here, since this is not your final resting place? Don't get too attached here. Remember that all of this is passing away. That's a Christian writing from the latter Middle Ages. Now we go to ancient Asia. This world is where the foolish sink down, but the wise aren't attached to it. Now, of course, ancient Buddhist thought and Christian thought from the Catholic Church from the latter Middle Ages it's going to look very different in how it actually works out in day-to-day life. We're talking about two very, very different cultures, right? And there are a lot of differences. We don't want to, understate that these cultures are going to look and feel very, very different, of course. But the point is that there are these underlying moral themes, these underlying ideas. And one idea that I think we can see at work here is that, of course, we have to do what we have to do to get on in this world. But there's more than this world. There's something beyond what we can see and feel right here. Don't get too attached to this, because this is passing away. Now, I think we'll add here something very different from yet another completely different source, and this comes to us from ancient Greece, from Aristotle. And Aristotle here is making a very, very different point. Here he's talking about, contemplation and the use of reason and thinking on, the highest sorts of things that human beings can think about. So the context of this statement is very different from the context of the other two statements we've seen. But still, I think I see something similar here. Let's look at the quote. The life of the gods is altogether happy, and that of man is happy, insofar as it contains something that resembles divine activity. In all three cases, and now of course what Aristotle means by the divine is very different from what Thomas à Kempis will mean by the divine, which is again very different from what the writer of the Dhammapada would mean by the divine. There's no question about it. We're looking at significant differences. But there seems to be underlying agreement that the way to have some kind of liberation in this world is to elevate our minds, in some sense, above what immediately surrounds us. Not to get too attached by this. And to, in a sense, have eternal thoughts. To direct our minds to things that are eternal. To direct our minds to things that are not specifically attached to this passing, transient world. And Aristotle here is saying that a human being is at his best. A human being is at her best when they are using their minds, they're using their reason, they're contemplating the best sort of things that can be contemplated, right? And when they're doing that, it's almost a kind of divine activity. And we might reflect on, what sorts of things, would we contemplate. And here I don't have the passage on the screen, but I would point you to just a beautiful list in St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 4, verse 8, where Paul gives a wonderful list of things that people should think about, things that are beautiful, things that are true, things that are lovely, things that are excellent. It's a beautiful bit of advice from St. Paul. Here are the kinds of things we should think about. And I think Aristotle says, yeah, and when we think about those kinds of things, that's a kind of divine activity, right? The gods are happy, and the life of man is happy insofar as it contains something that resembles divine activity. And for Aristotle, the thing that most reflects divine activity that human beings can do is to think well and to contemplate high and beautiful and noble things. And in doing that, we, in a sense, lift ourselves from the transience of this passing world. And there's that point of connection with the word of advice from Thomas à Kempis and with the word of advice from the writer of the Dhammapada.